Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. Dams are more common than you think. Author Steven Hawley, who joins us today, reports that 58,500 large dams around the world have trapped 3,155 gigatons of sediment, meaning that they're rapidly filling up and will eventually become useless to store water or generate electricity. Steven's new book, Cracked: The Future of Dams in a Hot, Chaotic World, was published in May by Patagonia. Cracked is a wide-ranging study of the many impacts, from social displacement and economic harm done to people to the environmental consequences of the climate-warming methane emissions created by dams and direct harm to wildlife, especially fish and waterfowl, when water stops flowing. If you want to understand dams, ranging from the small and often private blockages in streams to the massive government-owned dams like Grand Coulee, Glen Canyon, and Hoover dams, Steven's book is a guide to the different structures and many impacts they have on nature. Much of it is a manual about how to navigate the challenge of lobbying for dam removal and the practical problems involved in taking down a dam. You can find Cracked: The Future of Dams in a Hot, Chaotic World at Amazon, Powell's Books, and local bookstores. Welcome to the show, Steven. How are you doing today?
Just fabulous. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to call when you're sitting in a hotel room getting ready to do a talk on water law. Let me start off. Cracked is a really interesting read, and there's so much to it. But can you summarize what happens to a river, its water, and wildlife when a dam is put in place?
Well, I think a good analogy to make is what happens to the blood flow in a person's body when it's impeded. You know, rivers carry more than just water. They carry soil, they carry wood, they carry obviously fish and other types of wildlife, macroinvertebrate, aquatic insects. And so when you put a dam in a river, you create a kind of sclerosis in that river. The movement of energy downstream comes to a halt. Mm-hmm. And I would say the second thing that happens is after you stop the flow of that energy, you lose habitat both upstream and down. Everything that was living in upstream of the dam is, the habitat is lost for at least the extent of the reservoir. And then if you have a migratory corridor, of course, that's lost as well. So those are the two biggies. You're stopping the flow of energy in a river system, and then you're losing habitat both upstream and down.
And that habitat could be, for instance, migratory bird areas, that regions where they depended on that as a landing point on their travels through the world.
Sure. I mean, you look at the lower Snake River corridor, for example. I believe something like 50,000 acres of upland game bird habitat was lost because now, with those 4 reservoirs there just kind of cooking out in the desert in eastern Washington, there's no riparian area. There's no habitat left for those birds.
Yeah. So, now, the other thing that you call out very clearly is that dams contribute to global warming. How do they do that?
The main way they do that, and this is a relatively new branch of science, is they release methane. And if you think about, if you've ever stepped in a swamp or a pond or a shallow lake and your sandal gets caught in the muck and all this sort of foul-smelling, gas bubbles out of the muck in the bottom, that's methane. And while it occurs naturally in lakes and ponds, when you build a dam and fill up a reservoir, what you have is this constant influx of organic material into that reservoir. And it comes at a volume much higher and more concentrated than what you get in a natural lake. And so maybe 20 years ago, a group of scientists started tracking this phenomenon, and it turns out it's a lot more widespread than anybody had ever calculated. And the latest report, I think, came out in the summer of 2021. And the estimate is that the world's reservoirs behind dams have a greenhouse gas equivalent footprint the same as the country of Germany, which is the world's sixth largest offender in greenhouse gases. So this whole idea that hydropower is a clean, green source of energy is not entirely true. And slowly but surely, agencies and governing bodies that are trying to deal with climate change are starting to recognize this fact.
As a Washingtonian who's been hearing about our clean, green energy from hydro for decades now, that's so disappointing. But I've been recognizing this slowly but surely as the science has evolved. You used the Grand Coulee Dam project to sort of introduce all these ideas at the beginning of the book, and it shows
Sure.
that dams become economic and technological hubs that really change the history of a region. How did the Grand Coulee project or the Bonneville the Columbia-River-Basin project change Eastern Washington?
Well, it changed Eastern Washington in that it became the source of power that created Hanford. And in the book, I talk about how the original intent of Grand Coulee and every other giant public works project that came in the form of the dam is that it was intended to be this kind of rising tide that would lift all boats.
Right.
And what you got instead in Eastern Washington was a nuclear reservation that's now one of the world's most hazardous toxic waste sites. And then the second thing that you got is that didn't come out as advertised, I guess, is you have an irrigation project that instead of putting 10,000 families on 500,000 acres of arable farmland, has put about a quarter of that, and the balance of the labor that comes in that project doesn't come from working class farming families. It comes from imported labor. And in the book, I make the case that one of the biggest sort of indirect cost of the dam building era is the ongoing an extremely convoluted immigration policy that we have in this country. And part of that stems from the fact that when these dams were built, the engineers, certainly not the engineers, gave any thought to what kind of labor force would be needed to tend the amount of arable land that we created in the West. It turns out that it wasn't going to be working class family farms, but it was going to be a kind of underclass of migrant laborers. And that, of course, leads directly to the sort of convoluted and contradictory immigration policy that we have in this country today.
Well, that was really interesting to me because I lived and grew up driving through Eastern Washington. I've watched that region over 40, 50 years now transform into basically corporate farming. And
yeah,
your point about the influx of guest workers. So people come from Mexico every year to work in Eastern Washington and then purportedly go home. It's contributed to a lot of racial tensions, including the way even the towns around Hanford, the nuclear reservation, were designed to be essentially white enclaves surrounded by an underclass. Talk a little about how some of the worst cases of redlining and the like have developed in these rural settings where you wouldn't have expected them, but they're there because of the dam.
Sure. So in the book, I make the case, sort of leaning on some scholarship from other writers, that Richland, Washington, which is one of the Tri-Cities, is actually the sort of model of the post-World War II American suburb. And that was a planned community. It was entirely drawn up by General Electric, paid for with U.S. taxpayer dollars. And it was also, as is the case with a lot of upper middle class suburbs around the country today, it was also the case that brown and black skinned people were not welcome inside that Richland idealized suburban community. The way that happened is that the GE and the Department of Defense realized that they had a classic Western labor problem on their hands when they were building Grand Coulee Dam. And later on, when they were building Hanford, the problem is you get a bunch of surly young men together with a little bit of money in their pockets, and every kind of sort of illegal and lascivious activity that you can imagine goes on. And when you're out in the wet desert in Eastern Washington, if they can't do those things, nobody wants to stay. And so GE had this idea, what if instead of fencing these people in, we build a community where they want to stay? So they built schools, they built these, what were at the time considered to be very lavish homes, and created a kind of environment where, a suburb essentially, where people would want to stay. And at the time, journalists celebrated this model of planned community as the wave of the future, and certainly that proved to be true. What they didn't write about as much is how the less well-paid people that came to build Hanford were not in Richland. They were in the other two cities of the Tri-Cities, Kennewick, and help me out with the other one. I always forget one of the three Tri-Cities.
Pasco.
Pasco, thank you. Kennewick and Pasco became kind of the lower working class neighborhoods. And that sort of division persists to this day. And that didn't happen by accident. It was a result of the kind of labor that the government and its contractors decided they wanted to cultivate, and also by default, the kind of workers that they wanted to exclude.
But in another sense, it also, the projects treated everybody in those regions as guinea pigs. And as a result of the dams being there, Hanford was created, and Hanford released radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere on a long-term basis. That would not have happened had there not been a dam in the first place. But these secondary consequences of putting a dam in a region are you talk about a lot of different examples, but tell us about downwinders and the consequences of simply living near one of these facilities.
Sure, and I think it's important to keep in mind as we talk about this is the reason I include this in the book is the massive difference between what was intended when a project like Grand Coulee was built and what happened instead. So what happened instead is we built Hanford, and the electricity from Grand Coulee powered the Hanford nuclear reservation. And when the Second World War ended and the Cold War started, you had American scientists trying to figure out how much plutonium the Russians were making. And one way to do that was to peg the amount of iodine-131, which is a byproduct of plutonium production, to an estimated amount of plutonium production.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that they accidentally leaked iodine-131 onto the unsuspecting citizens of the Tri-Cities and Eastern Washington, and actually a much wider swath of the population in the Pacific Northwest. They did that on purpose. They purposely poisoned American citizens. And this experiment went on from 1949 to at least 1971. And in the book, I write about the first time that they intentionally poisoned American citizens was in 1949. And it was an experiment that went completely awry. They massively missed the weather forecast. That was part of it. And then they massively underestimated the amount of iodine that they were going to put into the atmosphere. It absolutely dwarfs the amount of nuclear toxins that were released in, for instance, in the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in 1979. It's orders of magnitude beyond that.
Yeah.
And in the book, I write about how a whole generation of Eastern Washingtonians died of thyroid cancers and other problems related to radiation exposure, and the government, to make a long story short, has denied their claims. So this is a direct result of, a dam building promise that was, again, supposed to be this rising tide that would lift all boats, and instead it caused cancer.
In fact, one of my grandfathers was a postman in Richland and died of thyroid cancer. And so painfully aware of how ubiquitous the impacts of the dam are, but I'd never really made the connection between the dam and his illness until I read your book. So it really was an eye-opener. Now, one of the things you've already been talking around is how little sense the economics of dams make. How can an entity like the Bonneville Power Administration that sells power generated by dams that were built 80 years ago still be $14.5 billion in debt and adding more debt every year? Why aren't these costs being covered by the ratepayers?
Well, Bonneville made a decision. You have to remember that Bonneville's job after the Second World War was to subsidize electricity to basically aluminum manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
And so while the rest of us were paying, what the Bonneville's policy was to sell power at what they called a postage stamp rate, which was just enough to cover their costs and float their budget for the next year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, their business model was to sell that electricity at that postage stamp rate, but then lose money selling power to aluminum smelters. And that's not a good business model, right? Remember, Bonneville gets no federal taxpayer dollars. They're supposed to be a self-financing entity.
Right.
So they started running up debts. And the way that they decided to cover that debt was to start selling excess power to markets outside the Pacific Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
And that proved to be a lucrative arrangement until it wasn't. And there are huge changes afoot in the electricity markets in the Western United States. Bonneville is scrambling to be a part of that huge change. But as you mentioned, they have these 80-year-old generating assets that oftentimes can't respond as efficiently or as quickly as some of the newer assets. For instance, California has added 20,000 megawatts of solar over the last 20 years. And if the contest and when there's a shortage of power in Southern California is to see who can get power the fastest to customers in, say, Los Angeles,
mm-hmm.
those newer generating assets are going to beat hydropower from the Pacific Northwest almost every time. So the model has become Bonneville gambling with ratepayers' money on whatever market looks the most profitable. And sometimes that works out okay. Bonneville's had a good year in the last, say, 12 to 18 months. Sometimes it doesn't work out at all because prior to that, they spent 10 years hemorrhaging money.
Right.
They burned through over $1 billion in cash reserves over the previous decade, and markets change. And so the question for people in this part of the country is, do you really want a federal entity playing giant utility company and really impeding the transition to solar, to wind, to storage that needs to happen as we're combating climate change? And Bonneville's answer is yes. You want those 80-year-old generating assets and all of our debt and everything else, because that's, they're in their own business plan. They say we want to be the preferred provider for power in the Pacific Northwest. So,
how can we simplify or democratize the management of dams in such a way that those of us who actually live in the regions impacted by the presence of the dam have some say in what the policies are?
I think the easiest way to do it, quite honestly, is to start with an honest accounting of what dams provide some benefit and which ones don't. For
mm-hmm.
instance, there's 31 dams in Bonneville's portfolio of generating assets, and 80% of Bonneville's revenue comes from 6 of those dams. Okay, so in other words, there's 25 that should really be undergoing some serious scrutiny, and there ought to be a fiscal mechanism of some kind to either upgrade those facilities so that they do provide some benefit, or in a lot of cases, if Bonneville wants to play corporate entity, then they're going to have to get rid of their stranded assets. And the stranded assets are the ones that aren't providing any benefit or any revenue for the BPA. And I think if you were to have an honest accounting of those other 25 dams that are marginal at best on Bonneville's balance sheet, you not only modernize the electricity grid, but it would have the ancillary benefit of saving a lot of habitat for salmon and other creatures that were, severely threatened under climate change.
Well, when you look at the generation associated with some of the dams, those 25 dams in the Bonneville network, they would be easily replaced by not even particularly large solar installations. And to your point about the hydro competing with renewables, true renewables, are there any ways that we can put incentives in place to take down those dams? And we'll talk more about that later in the show, but take down those dams in order to drive the adoption of solar and wind in the same region?
Well, I think the incentive is that, you're going to have to reform the Bonneville Power Administration. And that's proven to be a very hard nut to crack because policy makers and politicians in the Pacific Northwest still adhere to the mythology of hydropower in the Pacific Northwest. I think that mythology is as strong as the sort of myths around Oregon and Washington being timber states. You know, the idea of 40 years ago was that if you in any way, shape, or form hampered the timber industry, you were going to ruin the economy of the region. Well, I mean, that hasn't happened. We're not cutting timber on federal lands at nearly the clip we did back then. And last time I checked, the economy of the region has, done pretty well without that. And unfortunately, the hydro myth has persisted a little bit longer. You try to have a conversation with any congressional office in Oregon or Washington or even Idaho, with the exception of Congressman Mike Simpson, you're going to get the company line that Bonneville feeds these people, which is, you can't have a viable economy in the Pacific Northwest without hydropower. I don't think that's true anymore. As you mentioned, if you look at the amount of wind that's been installed, it's not, do we need to replace that power? It's, if you look at the numbers, that power has already been replaced.
It's obsolete.
Yeah, it is. I mean, with wind power alone, we've replaced for instance, the power of the 4 lower Snake River dams, which is all the controversy right now in the region of whether or not we should get rid of those. That power has been replaced 16 times over through conservation and the installation of wind power. Mm-hmm. So what are we waiting for? The other side, Bonneville and their constituents, have created this set of kind of moving goalposts for conservationists and the tribes that want to see salmon back in the Columbia River system. And the goalposts need to be set in place, and a sort of honest conversation about whether power from the lower Snake River dams actually needs to be, made up for, needs to happen.
I think that question, what are we waiting for, is a great place to take a quick commercial break, and then we'll come back and explore the other consequences of a dam. And we are back to continue the conversation with Steven Hawley. He's the author of Cracked, The Future of Dams in a Hot, Chaotic World, which was published in May by Patagonia. So, Steven, as we've already talked about, Washingtonians are accustomed to hearing that we have this renewable, sustainable energy, but hydroelectric-powered dams are not clean for a variety of reasons, but they don't have to do with direct pollution. They have to do with the impact on species like salmon, and by extension, the orca that feed on salmon. What's happened to fisheries along the Columbia River over the course of the past 100 years?
Well, you have to remember that those of us that live in the Columbia River watershed are living in what was, until recently, the world's greatest producer of the river system that produced more Chinook salmon than any other river system on Earth. Mm-hmm. And so what we've done is we've traded that fecundity, that richness, and an energy system that was based on the return of salmon as far as 1,000 miles inland. We traded that for another superlative, I guess. We transformed the Columbia into, one of the world's most hydro power developed river systems on the planet. And in fact, if you look at what happened in the 50s and 60s, the Corps of Engineers was exporting the model that they created on the Columbia all over the world to other river systems, the Mekong, for instance, in Asia. And so this was going to be the way of the future, but it proved to not be that way, because what you lost was that biological richness. And so salmon runs in the Columbia are less than 1% of their former biological richness. And there was a court case a while back, it's been quite a few years ago now, I believe it was in the mid-90s, where the court appointed an independent science panel to determine the percentage, the proportion of the loss of salmon that could be attributable to the construction of dams. And those scientists concluded that about 80% of the loss of salmon in the Columbia system was because of dams.
Mhm.
So one of the myths that I hope the book helps to dispel is this idea that you can have dams and salmon. And particularly in a climate change era, that doesn't seem to be true anymore.
One of the ways that we rationalize that loss of free-flowing rivers is that we put fish hatcheries in place. How's a hatchery fish different than a natural wild salmon?
So wild fish are sort of exquisitely adapted to their home streams. A salmon that swims up, for instance, the Tucannon River, a tributary of the Snake in eastern Washington, is genetically distinct from its nearby neighbor that swims up, say, Potlatch Creek just over the Idaho border in western Idaho. The genes of those fish are distinct. In other words, they develop to adapt to conditions in that area, in that stream. And so a wild salmon's sort of survival strategy has to do with diversity, a diversity of genes adapted to a diversity of habitats, and abundance. And what the hatchery system does is it takes away one of those two. It takes away diversity. When you use an agricultural model to try to reproduce a wild creature like a salmon, you wind up with kind of a monocrop of fish that are poorly adapted to the dynamic conditions that you find in any river system in the Pacific Northwest. And so the promise that we had with hatcheries that they were going to replace the wild abundance of salmon in the region it's another broken promise that hasn't come to fruition. In fact, it's had kind of the opposite effect because hatcheries have masked the decline of wild fish to the extent that I believe, and this is my opinion, that they've become a political rather than a biological tool. They keep fishermen from complaining too much about the lack of fish, and it gives politicians the cover to say, hey, look, we're doing something about this. We're making more fish. But the science shows that it's not a strategy that we've been experimenting with hatcheries for 140 years to no avail. So it's time to try something else. And I think the best hatchery, quite frankly, is a healthy river system.
I absolutely agree with that, but there's an economic point that you make as well. The cost of a hatchery fish compared to a wild salmon is extraordinary. How much does it cost taxpayers to have a hatchery fish return and potentially be caught along the way by fishermen?
Yeah, in the book, I think the average cost that I cite is $250 to $650 a fish. But in some places, it goes far beyond that. There's a hatchery system on the Deschutes River in Central Oregon that, Portland General Electric, which owns those dams, spent $140 million installing a sort of tower in the forebay of the dam that was supposed to facilitate hatchery fish moving up and down. And I think those have got to be some of the most expensive fish on Earth, because for $140 million, they've had far fewer than 5,000 fish return over the 12 or 15 years that system has been in place. So those with better math skills than me can divide 140 million by 4,000 fish and come up with, you wouldn't pay that much money for a salmon in the finest grocery store in the region. Let's put it that way.
Definitely not. Nor would those salmon be the same size as a wild fish, which is another concerning. No. So another area where dams are headed towards not just obsolescence, but just necessary retirement is silting. How much longer will a dam like Glen Canyon Dam be able to generate electricity and provide water and irrigation for human consumption in an area like the Southwest?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. I interviewed a scientist, a well-known scientist that worked in a couple different presidential administrations, who studied this issue, and he figures that Glen Canyon has less than 50 years left due to siltation. If you talk to the Bureau of Reclamation, they'll stick to their original estimate, which is, a few centuries. The bulk of evidence is more towards the 50 years timeline. There's actually two huge sediment plumes in Lake Powell right now. One is up against the sort of north abutment of Glen Canyon Dam itself, and the other is on the shallow end of the reservoir where the Colorado River stops flowing and turns into, miles and miles of slack water. And between those two sediment plumes, on the shallow end, what you get, of course, with shallow water is increased evaporation on top of the sedimentation. So where there used to be 5 marinas on Lake Powell, now there's 2.
Yep.
And, the other scary thing about that scenario, though, is with siltation and increased evaporation, and I tell this whole story in gory detail in the book, there's a scenario that is going to happen in the next decade or two where the Colorado River may not be able to flow past Glen Canyon Dam because the engineers that designed the dam never conceived of a scenario where you would have 20 or 30 straight years of far below average precipitation.
Right.
We're living in an era of what the term in meteorology is aridification, where we're drying out, and a reservoir, built under the assumption that we would always have snowpack and rain like we did in the middle of the 20th century, that is proving to not hold up.
The Colorado hasn't run to the ocean for decades, but what you're describing is the impact of that sclerosis, that it is literally shrinking back up the river channel and dying like a blood vessel that's been cut off. It's shocking to think about this.
Yeah, it is. It's going to be even more shocking for the 30 million people downstream of Glen Canyon Dam that rely in one form or another on the flowing Colorado River to meet their water needs. All of a sudden, America will have its own version of Saudi Arabia in the Southwest because the Colorado River, between when the reservoir drops below the level of the penstocks, the intakes for the turbines that produce electricity, there's no other way for the Colorado River to get out of Lake Powell. So people are thinking, well, we have time because the reservoir now would have to drop about another 90 feet for that to happen. Well, remember that since the turn of this century, 23 years ago, we've lost 140 feet of water level out of that reservoir. So it's coming, it's not a matter of if, it's just when.
Well, you've mentioned the fact that salmon are a political tool, that dams and water rerouting changes in societies. So the economic, social, and environmental challenges of removing a dam are fully politicized, and there's people fighting on every aspect of this. How is taking a dam down an exercise in grassroots organizing and door-to-door diplomacy? You talked about this in the context particularly of the Klamath River project, which is removing 4 dams.
It is a sort of an intense exercise in local and sometimes on a larger dam removal project, regional democracy, because it's different than most of the exercises that we undertake in the world of conservation, right? Everything that we've done, or most things that we've done in the world of conservation, have been saying no to something. No to developing this wildflower meadow. No to dumping toxins in a lake or a stream or on a given piece of land. Dam removal is saying yes to something else. It's saying yes to sort of putting our faith in the ability of, I think, 2 things: nature to heal itself after it's been compromised by the actions of humankind, but also it's putting faith in humanity in its ability to negotiate the terms of kind of resilience and healing once we've done harm to a river. And so it's a much more long-term process. I wish there was a way to speed it up. I don't really talk about that too much in the book, but everybody that has seen dam removals agrees there needs to be more of them, and they need to happen faster. So in the book, I interview a couple people that have been sort of instrumental in some large dam removal projects. And there's some really, I think, inspiring advice for would-be dam busters that, one of the things that a woman, Laura Roche, says, you don't need to convert everybody to the side of dam removal. You just need to get the naysayers to stand down. And the way you do that is you go knock on their door and you have coffee with them and you eat their brownies and you say, this could be all right for you. This may not help you, but I don't think it's going to hurt you. She earned the trust of lots of people, just going with that sort of door-to-door diplomacy that is becoming a lost art in our world.
Do you see evidence that a coalition of community members can overcome the immense economic advantage and benefit that the large or the wealthiest participants in the region enjoy from the dams? I mean, is there if I'm building a coalition, what group should I bring in?
Well, right now what we're seeing on the Columbia is that the original inhabitants of the Pacific Northwest, the Columbia River tribes, coming together in an unprecedented way to lobby intensely for the removal of the Snake River dams.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a coalition that's come together in the last decade that they're unified and sort of strengthened in a way that I haven't seen before. And certainly indigenous voices, again, as the original inhabitants of this part of the country, are and should be leading the way. The other constituency that is too often overlooked is just, even if you don't give much of a care about free-flowing rivers or fish, consumers of electricity, which is all of us in this region, would really do well to take a hard look at what they're getting out of the hydro system. The hydro system provides about half of the electricity in the region. The other half gets sold outside the region. And as I mentioned earlier, Bonneville could make 80% of the revenue it currently has from 6 of the dams that they sell power from. And we know that dams are net contributors to climate change. We know that the infrastructure that they, represent is approaching a century old, and it's going to be time to move on. And if we don't get ahead of the curve, just from an economic standpoint, the longer we wait to sort of jump into the 21st century with the grid and with our generating assets, the more expensive it's going to be. And I am somewhat concerned that in the Pacific Northwest, we're going to be stuck not only with rivers with no fish in them, but with some of the most expensive electricity in the country if we don't move to do, for instance, what California's done over the last 20 years.
Well, that would be the ultimate irony, that the region with the least expensive power for a long time became the region with the most expensive power. But the hopeful note that I came away from the book with is how quickly a river can recover when a dam's taken down. Tell us about what happened along the Klamath River and what you saw over the course of just a few years.
Yeah, well, the Klamath dams they just started coming out here this year. But what I've seen in a couple different places, I'll give you 2 examples. One on the Elwha River on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. The fear there was that there was so much silt that had accumulated behind those 2 dams that were removed that it would create a disaster. And instead, what it created is a whole new estuary where the Elwha dumps into the Strait of San Juan de Fuca. It's really like almost a whole new bit of earth. The amount of aquatic habitat that's been created there is creating opportunities for all kinds of fish and wildlife that wasn't there before. And the very rapid rebuilding of estuary has become the story of the Elwha's recovery. There are salmon and steelhead returning in unprecedented numbers to the Elwha system, but part of that bounty is due to the fact that all of this rearing habitat that's in the estuary that wasn't there before is now there and available. In the book I write about it had all these kind of unintended benefits, like there's a surf break now in Freshwater Bay, which is adjacent to the mouth of the Elwha, that now develops much more regularly than it once did, and it's created a headache for the little neighborhood in Freshwater Bay there. Please, if you go there, find a place to park that won't make the neighbors mad. But, nonetheless, an opportunity to surf is not something that people associate with the dam removal, but again, we have to remember that rivers don't carry just water. They carry sediment. They carry the potential to create and remake habitats that we've lost.
Well, that is a great and encouraging place to stop. And I hope folks will take time to read the book in order to understand how they can participate in activism to take these things down. Steven, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Hey, I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show.
We've been speaking with Steven Hawley, author of Cracked, The Future of Dams in a Hot, Chaotic World. And we'll include links to find the book in the article that accompanies this podcast. Steven's analogy between river systems and the circulatory system is critically important to understanding how the industrial era has remade nature in the image of a particularly destructive approach to natural resources. The take, make, waste features of the consumer economy are reported and amplified in the treatment of water, wildlife, and communities along river systems. Cutting off the flow of water interferes with every other system with which the river interacts. A dam is a sclerosis, a sclerotic obstruction that a doctor, if it was a human body, would remove to repair our health. But we're stuck with these things due to the enduring economic and political influence of the myth of clean hydroelectric power. Let's look at the facts. In 2022, the cost to a customer of a kilowatt hour of electricity generated by the Bonneville Power Administration ranged from 3.4 cents per kilowatt hour to 7.8 cents per kilowatt hour. By contrast, the global average cost of a kilowatt hour of solar power was just 4.8 cents, right in the middle of the Bonneville Power Electric range. And that's according to the International Renewable Energy Agency. When you add in the dire environmental consequences of dams, like the 99% loss of salmon runs over the past 100 years, the era of dams clearly needs to end. Yet in other countries like China and Vietnam, their damming projects are just getting started, relatively speaking. Perhaps the United States can help other nations avoid the long-term consequences of dams by leading the dam busting movement. And Steven's book is a great way to learn how to get involved in that. I hope you'll take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 420 interviews we've produced on sustainability in your ear with your friends and your family. Tell your coworkers. And if you take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, that will help your neighbors find us too. You folks are the amplifiers that spread more ideas so we can create less waste. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and all sorts of other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. Ask people to look for us, and thank you all for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself. Take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.